Hollywood was never just a place. It was a machine. A carefully constructed factory of fantasy designed to make you believe exactly what it wanted you to believe, and forget everything it didn't. Stars were manufactured, scandals were buried, and identities? Identities were rewritten entirely. But what happens when the secret isn't a rumor, a tabloid headline, or a studio whisper? What happens when the secret is a person, a real, breathing human being whose entire existence was erased, repackaged, or simply deleted from the historical record? Tonight, we're going where film historians rarely go. We're examining 10 remarkable individuals connected to Hollywood's golden age, whose stories challenge everything you were taught about who built this industry. By the time we reach number 1, you'll understand that gender diversity in American entertainment isn't new, it was simply silenced. Stay with us, because number 3 will completely reframe a name you already know. And number 1? Number 1 will change the way you think about Hollywood history forever. Let's establish something important before we begin. Hollywood's golden age, roughly spanning the 1920s through the early 1960s, operated under a system of near-total studio control. The major studios, MGM, Paramount, Warner Bros., RKO, they weren't just production companies, they were governing bodies that controlled their talent's public image, private relationships, living arrangements, and legal identities. For individuals born female who chose to live differently, whether that meant presenting as men, working under male names, or simply refusing to perform femininity as the industry demanded, the consequences ranged from career destruction to complete institutional erasure. Publicists were paid to suppress, archivists were instructed to destroy, and for decades, it worked. But archives age, historians dig, and the truth, as it always does, begins to surface. What follows is a carefully researched, historically grounded countdown of 10 individuals whose stories Hollywood worked very hard to keep secret, and whose legacies are long overdue for the full light of day. 10th, Julian Eltinge. We open our countdown with Julian Eltinge, not because he was born female, but because his story frames everything that follows with painful precision. Eltinge was one of early Hollywood's most bankable stars, celebrated internationally for his extraordinary female impersonation, both on stage and screen. Audiences adored him. Studios profited enormously from him. But here's the irony that haunts this story. Eltinge's contracts contained explicit clauses preventing him from displaying any gender nonconformity in his private life. The man whose entire career was built on blurring gender boundaries was legally forbidden from living authentically outside the theater. Hollywood was perfectly comfortable profiting from the performance of fluid gender. It simply refused to honor the reality. Eltinge's story is a warning, and it sets the stage intentionally for everything more complex that follows. Transition, but the real secrets weren't about performance, they were about survival. Dorothy Lawrence. Dorothy Lawrence gained international attention for disguising herself as a male soldier to serve on the Western Front during World War I. A documented, verified act of extraordinary courage. But fewer people know that Lawrence later attempted to enter the entertainment circuit using a male-presenting identity, seeking work in the early theatrical world that fed directly into silent film culture. Her memoir was suppressed by British military authorities who feared the implications of her story. By the time American entertainment came calling, the institutional machinery had already done its work. Dorothy Lawrence's narrative had been systematically minimized, discredited, and buried. Her case represents something deeply important. The same forces that erased women from military history were equally active in erasing gender non-conforming individuals from entertainment history. 8th, the erased MGM file. In 1934, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's internal personnel records, portions of which were unsealed by archivists decades later and examined by film scholars at UCLA, make reference to a background performer employed under a male stage name whose original intake documentation lists a female birth record. This individual worked on the MGM lot for approximately 2 years before vanishing from every available record. No forwarding address, no union documentation, no credit, no name confirmed in any public release. This isn't speculation. The file reference exists, the gap in the record exists. Hollywood didn't merely hide these stories. In some cases, it performed a methodical, institutional deletion. And that deliberate absence tells its own devastating story. Transition, and when deletion wasn't possible, they simply changed the name. 7th, the touring stage performers. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, traveling theatrical productions adapted stories of historically male figures, pirates, soldiers, outlaws, for American touring circuits that connected directly to Hollywood casting pipelines. Theater historians, including scholars working from the Harvard Theater Collection, have documented multiple instances of female-born performers who, after years of inhabiting male roles in long touring runs, continued living as men off stage. Several of these individuals eventually transitioned into early film work, their male identities intact and entirely undocumented as anything other than what they presented. Their names were changed in every surviving promotional record. Their original identities were never recovered. They built careers, relationships, and lives, and Hollywood cast them, paid them, and then pretended they never existed the moment their story threatened to become complicated. Sixth, William Dorsey Swan's Performance Circle. Before Hollywood had a name, before the first camera rolled on a California lot, there existed a vibrant and fiercely protected underground performance culture in American cities, where gender was fluid, celebrated, and creatively negotiated. Historian Claire Sears, in her groundbreaking academic work on gender regulation in 19th and early 20th century America, documented how multiple performers born female who lived as men moved through vaudeville circuits that directly fed early silent film casting culture. This wasn't a fringe phenomenon, this was a pipeline. From underground performance halls to traveling vaudeville stages to the emerging film industry, these individuals carried their identities with them at every step, and at every step, the official record was scrubbed clean. Their presence in early Hollywood history is statistically probable and documentarily invisible. That combination is not an accident. Now we move to names with full historical documentation, and the deliberate silence surrounding them becomes even harder to forgive. Fifth, Lucy Hicks Anderson. Lucy Hicks Anderson was born in 1886 and assigned female at birth. She lived her entire adult life as a woman with extraordinary grace, determination, and public visibility. She cooked for military officers, hosted celebrated social gatherings, and moved freely in circles that overlapped directly with early Hollywood's social elite in Southern California. When U.S. Army authorities attempted to use her birth record to prosecute her after World War II, Lucy responded with one of the most defiant and articulate letters in American civil rights history, writing that she had simply refused to be classified as something she was not. Lucy Hicks Anderson's story is not rumor, it is not archive speculation. It is fully documented, deeply human, and historically significant. Hollywood's social world knew her. The industry that built its reputation on storytelling simply chose not to tell hers. That choice was not neutral. It was deliberate. Fourth, the female stunt performers of the 1930s. This entry genuinely surprises most film historians when they first encounter it. Throughout the 1930s, a documented pattern emerged within Hollywood's stunt performance community. Female-born stunt workers, some of the most physically talented and fearless individuals on any studio lot, routinely adopted male names and male-presenting identities to access stunt contracts that paid significantly more than roles available to women. Screen Actors Guild records examined by film scholars in the 1990s identified multiple individuals whose gender designations differed between birth certificates and studio employment documentation. These weren't individuals who were confused or deceptive. They were professionals navigating a system that deliberately undervalued and underpaid women, making a calculated and entirely rational decision to claim the identity that gave them fair access to their own craft. Hollywood took their physical courage every single day. It took their bodies, their risk, and their skill. It never once took their credit, because officially, they didn't exist. We're entering the top 3. The stories from here require your full attention. Third, Billy Tipton. Billy Tipton. Remember that name if you don't already know it. Billy was a jazz musician, a band leader, a recording artist who performed across the American entertainment circuit throughout the mid-20th century. He married. He adopted 3 sons. He built a complete, loving, fully inhabited life as a man in the world of American popular music, a world that orbited Hollywood, fed its sound stages, and shaped its cultural identity throughout the Golden Age and beyond. When Billy died in 1989, the paramedics who responded discovered that Billy had been assigned female at birth. His sons, his own children, were hearing this for the first time. Diane Wood Middlebrook later wrote the definitive biographical account, examining how Billy navigated identity, performance, and privacy across 5 extraordinary decades. What strikes historians most isn't the secrecy, it's the completeness. Billy Tipton didn't live a partial life or a compromised life. He lived his life, fully, professionally, relationally, and with remarkable integrity. The music industry that benefited from his talent spent years after his death sensationalizing his story rather than honoring it. Billy Tipton deserved better from history, and now, finally, history is beginning to catch up. Transition to remain, and we have saved the most historically significant truths for exactly this moment. Second, Alan L. Hart. Alan L. Hart was born Alberta Lucille Hart in 1890. By 1918, over a century ago, Alan had undergone a hysterectomy as part of gender-affirming medical treatment, making him one of the first documented individuals in the United States to access such care. His physician, Dr. Joshua Allen Gilbert, documented the case. The record exists. Alan went on to become a pioneering tuberculosis researcher, whose work on X-ray screening programs is directly credited with saving thousands of American lives. He wrote novels. He lived and worked openly as a man throughout his professional life. His contributions to American medicine are taught in public health programs. His identity, the full truth of who he was, is almost never mentioned in the same breath. Alan Hart moved in literary and intellectual circles that intersected with early Hollywood culture. His existence is not theory, it is documented historical fact. And it proves, with absolute clarity, that trans men were not invented recently. They were simply a history that powerful institutions, medical, cultural, and cinematic, chose to suppress. Alan Hart's name belongs in the same conversation as every celebrated figure of his era. It has been kept out of that conversation for far too long. Final reveal. First, the unnamed pioneers. And so we arrive at number 1. And number 1 does not belong to a single name. In 2019, the One Archives at the University of Southern California, the oldest continuously operating LGBTQ archive in the United States, published a preliminary research finding with a conclusion that has since reverberated through academic film history communities. Their archivists, working through pre-code Hollywood personnel records from 1929 to 1934, identified a statistically significant pattern of gender non-conforming performers employed under male names, several of whom had female birth records on file with studios that simply chose not to act on that information. Think about what that means. The studios knew, and in a quiet, pragmatic, entirely unacknowledged way, some of them simply didn't care, because these individuals were talented, dependable, and profitable. Pre-code Hollywood, for one brief and fascinating window before the Hays Code tightened its grip in 1934, was quietly more inclusive than the industry spent the next 8 decades pretending it had ever been. Number 1 is every person whose name was removed from a file, crossed out of a ledger, or simply never written down at all. It is every performer who showed up, did extraordinary work, and was erased not because they failed, but because the truth of who they were was considered more dangerous than their talent was considered valuable. Their stories are number 1 because they are the foundation. Every visible history rests on an invisible one. And Hollywood's invisible history is far richer, far more diverse, and far more human than the machine ever wanted you to know. Hollywood's golden age was never the clean, binary, perfectly pressed narrative that studio publicity departments sold to the world. Behind every carefully managed photograph, every approved biography, every sanitized press release was a human being, complicated, real, and often living a truth that the industry around them refused to honor, protect, or preserve. The 10 stories in this countdown represent thousands more that were never recorded. Performers whose names are gone. Artists whose contributions are uncredited. Individuals whose courage built an industry that responded by pretending they never existed. That changes when we start paying attention. It changes when we ask the questions that official histories were designed to prevent. It changes when audiences like you choose to engage with the full, complicated, extraordinary truth of who actually built the world we inherited. If this video opened your eyes to a history you were never taught, hit that like button. Share this with someone who loves film history, who studies gender history, or who simply believes that every human being deserves to have their story told with honesty and respect. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next in this series, because we are just getting started.